Have you wondered why so many people are still in denial about climate change and the human causes of climate change? And how, as we discuss this issue and it gets involved in our politics and other things, the anger level of some people and resistance to the steps and actions needed to address climate change seems to be escalating rather than people coalescing around the solutions that are needed for a healthy future. These conundrums, these paradoxes have really been grappling my attention over the last number of weeks and months. And as I've been thinking about, well, how is it when we have all this science that's so clear about the consensus that human-caused global warming is affecting our climate and doing so in disastrous ways, that we still have these and increasing areas of denial and resistance and really obstacles for effective action. So I've taken a look at this and I want to share with you what I've learned about this topic. And what I've learned fundamentally is that, this is not a question of science and what science is right and which science isn't. That's pretty well settled. What it's really a question about is how do we as humans deal with challenges like this. And so it's really much more an issue, a psychological issue of how humans deal with change and what's needed to help them do that effectively. So let me share some perspectives and ideas about this learning with you and assist you in thinking about how you can make a difference for a climate to be pursued that's healthy for all of us and for our future. First, looking at some data, the denial remains fairly substantial. Only a slight majority of people believe that there's human-driven climate change is the primary driver of what we're experiencing. That varies, of course, by political role. But what's striking is that although there's a majority of people who favor alternative energy, 55% that you can see there, obviously, again, shifting very dramatically by political affiliation, that what's striking is that climate remains low in the importance to voters. So what this means is that while people understand what's needed, their decisions about for whom to vote are not fundamentally driven by climate issues. And I think is a sobering fact for us that are involved in trying to help us to have a healthy climate future. That if we don't have voters really having that as a driving issue, then we don't get candidates who have it as a driving issue, and we don't get elected officials then that enact the kinds of actions that are required for a successful future. So how can we understand this resistance? How can we understand this sense of denial? How can we get deeper into what's going on here and how we can consider it effectively? And as I thought about this, I thought that, what we're really talking about here is not just shifting how we use energy and what forms of energy we use. We're really at a fundamental level changing some of the ways in which we work and behave. We're changing our orientation towards the convenience of plastics that are largely petrochemically derived. We're changing our attitudes about the transportation and whether we share rides or we take public transportation or whatever versus the old American idea that I've got a car and I can just drive it anywhere I want. And we're facing the same thing even in our kitchens as people are thinking about, the importance of us moving to all electric kitchens and away from gas-fired stoves and ovens that have very significant health and climate greenhouse gas emissions consequences. So these are really some very fundamental things that get to our human nature. So that really brings us to a sense of, okay, we're going to have to let go of something that we've been using and following in order to adopt something new. And letting go of something always involves some level of grief or loss, even if it's something that we know is good for us and would be helpful to do. It's even, in the food we eat, if having that big juicy hamburger or steak, and having less of that to have a plant-based diet so that we can have less greenhouse gas emissions in the creation and transportation of our food, is again letting go of something that we had before. And that is not something that humans do readily. It's something that, in particular, Americans are very resistant to. Europeans are ahead of us on many climate issues because they live in a culture where there have been much more this sense of constraint. They live closer together. The countries are smaller. They haven't had this big, expansive Wild West that the United States has enjoyed, for centuries. So they live within a place of constraint rather than this place of, well, there should be absolute freedom to do anything that I want as long as I don't directly impact my neighbor. Well, the result of that around climate issues is that, yes, people don't perceive that they're impacting, but their actions are impacting their neighbors and neighbors around the world because the greenhouse gases are having such a profound effect on the climate, and that in turn is affecting everybody around the world. But the connection there is less direct and immediate, and it requires us to have a different concept of how we think about what's involved and how do we approach it. So as I looked at it, what came to my mind was actually Kubler-Ross's classic work on death and dying, from a physical point of view. How do people deal with grief, and how could that model be of some, at least metaphorical use for us in thinking about climate change? So here is that model. It essentially has the stages of when people are confronted with their death, they're in denial about it. No, it's not going to happen to me. It's not going to happen to my loved one. Then there's anger, like, oh, why me? How come? Then there's bargaining, like, okay, if that's the situation, like, okay, how can I make the best of what I have? Or how can I more fully enjoy what's being taken away from me before it's taken away? Then there's depression, which is, oh my gosh, this is a reality and this is what I'm dealing with. And so for actually some of us working actively on climate action issues, we're at the next stage here, which is depression. And that is feeling hopeless, like, okay, we're trying, we're doing all these things, we're making people aware of what's at stake, and yet things aren't happening. I can't seem to make a difference. And that becomes very depressing. And then finally, there's an acceptance, which is embracing, what is the reality of the situation. And you can see here on this chart how those stages of death and dying for our physical selves actually maps fairly well in what we can see happening in the stages of fossil fuel transition. The people first rejecting climate science, like, oh, I don't really believe that. Then they were resistant to climate policies, like, okay, I don't want anyone to tell me what I should or shouldn't do. And then they say, okay, well, we'll have clean coal. We won't have the dirty coal. We'll have ways to scrub it, or we'll draw down the greenhouse gas emissions that we're letting out into the atmosphere, and we'll concentrate it down with huge fans and bury it in the ground as carbon. You get all sorts of different approaches that people have. And then there's some people who feel like, oh my gosh, what can I really do? Is it going to make a difference? And then finally, there's a process of embracing what's involved, not only in adopting renewable energies, but in adopting the changes in our lives that need to accompany that in order for it to be successful. So there's a lot been written about the Kubler-Ross model. It's been in existence for a long time. A lot of people argue, well, it really isn't a linear model. There's actually loops, and people go into and around through these stages multiple times, or through parts of the stages multiple times. And there are other sorts of explanations. But I think it's helpful to have some kind of framework here and understand the challenges we face on climate change in some broader framework that can give us a way to look at it. As I've examined this and examined, okay, what seems to drive denial and resistance, there's a number of factors that come up. There are personal psychological defenses that people have. We've been talking some about that. There's tribal identities. That's where you're seeing the concentration of points of view in different political parties or different groups within political parties, so that there's a sense of, well, I'm part of this group and this group believes or stands for X, whether or not, that is what somebody might personally evaluate and decide for themselves was indeed their own perspective and point of view. And then there are economic interests. We're going to talk about those that are amplified by these political and media narratives into something that's even more powerful and stronger. So I'm going to take a look at a couple of these and explore them in a little bit more detail with you and invite you to think about, okay, what can we do to address that? And then I'm going to offer some solutions at the end, because this is the Climate Solutions Now conference, and want to leave you with, well, what are ways that we can help crack this nut? How can we move through and get people engaged in more constructive and effective ways? So a couple of the underlying forces, and there's a whole series of them packaged within the prior slide that I had about the different things that are driving this. But one of them is cognitive dissonance. And that's an interesting issue about if people hold one point of view and they get information or whatever that's contrary to that, how do they resolve that? And how do they deal with that effectively? So here's some examples of that one. People might say, I believe in climate change, but I'm just one person, so it doesn't really matter what I do. And of course, when we have millions and billions of people potentially taking that point of view, we have massive greenhouse gas emissions. We have massive mounds of discarded plastics. We have a huge and an amazing problem. I also get, from people who are even in the climate movement, or sympathetic to the need for some things to be done, who say, well, what about China and India? And what's really interesting, and I share this information with them, is that the collective greenhouse gases that have been emitted by humans over the industrial period of the last several centuries is 1.5 trillion tons of greenhouse gases. Now, the interesting thing I learned in writing the book, Solve Climate Change Now, Do What You Love for a Healthy Planet, is that those greenhouse gases stay up there for 300 to 1,000 years. So we have the collection of all of that greenhouse gases. It's not like they go up there and then they eventually blow away or whatever else. They do, but not until after a very, very long period of time, especially with carbon dioxide. Which is the primary greenhouse gas. So if you look at the total contribution to that 1.5 trillion, it's the United States with 1/3 of that total. The next one is China with half of what the United States contribution is, and then others fall down from there. Now, certainly China and India are coming forward very rapidly, but we can't expect to say, okay, we've gotten here, but now everybody else has to follow. That follows has to do their economy in a different way, in a costlier way for them, because we have emitted so much greenhouse gases and created so many consequences for them. We instead have to think, okay, how are we going to refigure this? How are we going to position ourselves more effectively? And then, some people say, well, big government or big corporations need to solve this. And of course, that doesn't really work, right? Because as we were talking before, elected officials really only follow what their constituents do. And if they don't see their constituents acting, they're not going to advocate for a policy or position that they know runs counter to the desires of their constituents to be unfettered in their emission of greenhouse gases. And if we expect corporations to do it and expect to regulate corporations in going about doing that, corporations do what their um, uh, consumers and customers ask for them. And if the customers and consumers aren't asking for clean energy efforts to produce the products and services that are being delivered and aren't tracking and giving attention to how those corporations exercise their responsibilities, there's not going to be a real change in that environment either. So clearly this issue of cognitive dissonance here is a factor that impacts denial and when pushed can actually result in angry responses from people, and we see that. Now, there's another dimension of this, which is what's called path dependence. And that's the idea that, well, we've got a system of working, we've got a way of operating, our economy and our social patterns are such that we have a limited ability to change them. Now, of course, we do every day. We make a decision as a consumer. We can change what our choices are, but we need to be conscious about that in order to make the change. So, what can we do about that? And of course, one of the things that's really amazing, as I was analyzing the data, is that the market value of proven fossil fuel reserves is about $183 trillion. So that's what the corporations for gas, oil, and coal have, as their economic value. The market is how the market is valuing it. So writing that down or heading that off is a huge obstacle for them, and one that's going to be very impactful. So need to take a look at how those economic forces come into play and how we can make a difference along those. In contrast, renewable energy is just a fraction of a percentage point in terms of the market value of the companies that are offering that alternative. So there's a huge economic force here, and we need to take a look at it. And how can what are some of the prospects for this? Well, I took a look at some of the patterns in the past, and it took about 100 years from 1850 to 1950 to shift from coal to oil as the dominant energy source. It took another 50 years for natural gas to be the major energy source. And, people projecting from past patterns have come up with 50 plus years for us to get to a renewable energy transition. Far too long for what would be healthy for our planet. So what can we do? And that's where I want to end, is sharing with you some very specific ideas here. First, we need to educate others. There's a great book, Saving Us, by Katharine Hayhoe, that offers ideas and information about how to communicate with other people about, what are the facts of the situation, what's driving this, and how can we be effective in our conversations with another. We can engage in conversations, direct conversations. In the book, Solve Climate Change Now, Do What You Love for a Healthy Planet that I wrote, I've got in there a 20-minute conversation that you can have. It's a series of simple questions. What are your hopes for a healthy climate future? What do you enjoy doing? What are the climate needs that you'd like to address? And then where's the matchup of those in your climate sweet spot? And everybody out of those conversations comes up with things that they can do personally. When they start to do things personally, that's the path to making change for the future. And you can advocate for policy changes. That's what the Citizens Climate Lobby does. I'm pleased to be an active participant in that, and with our lobbying on Capitol Hill. We can lead by example, like with Project Drawdown has, what are the most impactful things that we can do individually, and how can those be made into actionable things for us? There's local versions of that with the Slow Climate Coalition or others that are in your communities, and we can inspire others to participate in organizations like 350.org, where we come together and work on these topics in unison. So many opportunities exist for us. We need to capture those opportunities. When we do, action is the antidote to anxiety. So if you're feeling anxious, if you're in that depression place about climate change, best thing to do is take action. And when you do, it will have a healthy climate for all. And I thank you for your attention and hope that you enjoy being a climate solver.